My name is Lisa Henderson. I'm proud Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, host of the annual Clissold Lecture. I want to mention some thanks and then introduce Jeffrey Kofman, Graduate Program Director in the Masters in Media for Journalism and Communication. Programs he will introduce our distinguished guest, Jeffrey Kofman. For organizing today's event, I want to briefly say thanks to the MMJC faculty, especially Jeremy and Mark Rainer, to Lily Dang, our Dean's Office Administrator, for many critical details, and to our Alumni Development Officer, Tracy Fodry, who stewards the Clissold gift. Jeremy will also thank our many tech experts here today. Our primary thanks goes to the Clissold family, whose gift endows this annual lecture. The Clissold Lecture is one of the high points of the year at Western, especially for the MMJC program, funded by a request from the family in honor of the life and work of Edward Clissold, who lived from 1833 to 1915 and was an editor and publisher. The annual lecture is an opportunity for Canada's leading journalists to give Western and the London community a greater understanding of their work. This is, of course, an especially important year now, in the middle of the time of great turbulence in the world, of course, we know this, but also in the world of journalism. We've all survived. We continue to survive the claim that we are in a post-truth period. Does anyone here actually believe that? Raise your hand. I look forward to it. There are standpoints in matters of interpretation always, as every lawyer and literary critic, and especially every journalist knows. But that's saying something quite different than the claim to post-truth, and maybe you won't have to debate this. From my standpoint as FIMS Dean and the Communication and Media Studies Scholar for 30 years, we're not post-truth, and we certainly aren't post-journalism. Business models have been in flux for almost 20 years. Newspaper organizations are looking for new ways to thrive. There's talk in some parts of the U.S. that we need a journalism corps, much like the Peace Corps, because the work must go on even in places that once housed it are changing dramatically. But there remains an enduring place for storytelling with conscience. Last year's Clissold lecturer, Randy Richmond, recently published a 6-part story in the London Free Press, which I know many of you read, about police misconduct, a story that was disturbing, not least as a newcomer to London, and whose acuity with documents and timelines alone, alongside his new sources, made it as essential as it is disturbing. If you want an accountable police force, you need a great city investigating. We're graced by Randy Richmond's instruction as a teacher in FIMS this semester. Jeffrey Kofman is no stranger to hard stories told with conscience, nor to changes in the practice of journalism, and he's here to speak to us about both today. I won't say more because I know that Jeremy will say a lot in his introduction, but this is where we have to thank we have to thank the Clissold family for welcoming guests who hold our feet and hearts to the fire as writers, storytellers, politicians, military commanders, entrepreneurs, and deans. That old journalistic tradition of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, and the need for that tradition has not diminished. The terms of delivery have changed, and for that I'm very grateful to Jeffrey for coming today, and for their gift of our accountability. I'm grateful to the Clissold family. So welcome, Jeremy.
Just before I introduce Jeffrey, I just want to say a few more thank yous, as Lisa mentioned I was going to. Thank you very much for all the people who put this together. So that includes Mark Rainer, Lily Dang, Sarah Irons, Ella Young, Sharon Waters, Paul Buckley-Golder, and Ella McGran. There's a lot of work that goes into putting an event like this together, and without them, this would not be happening. Jeffrey began his journalism career at CBC as a national news correspondent anchor and radio host and documentary producer. So Canadians started here in Canada and then went off and never moved back. He spent 3 years as a correspondent in the New York Bureau of CBS News. He joined ABC News as the network's Miami-based correspondent for Latin America, Florida, and the Caribbean. And then he left a job where he was near Miami Beach, in the sands of Miami Beach, to go work in the desert in Iraq, which is a strange call, but that's what journalists do. From 2003 to 2005, he rotated in and out of Baghdad to cover the Iraq War. In 2010, Jeff moved to Europe to be the London correspondent for ABC News. And for 4 years, he covered stories in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa from London. After reporting from more than 40 countries, Jeff left ABC News 5 years ago to begin building Trint. And I'm going to use Trint as a noun, but apparently it's a verb as well, I've discovered today. Trint uses an automated transcription system and artificial intelligence to transcribe things like interviews, speeches, lectures, and news conferences. Jeff continues to work as a journalist. He's a global affairs analyst at BBC News. He's a regular on the Dateline London and on several BBC radio programs. So I'd like to please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeffrey Kofman. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is that microphone working, I think? So I live in the other London, the one that's named after this one. And I've lived there for 10 years. I moved there as a journalist. As Jeremy noted, I began at Global before CBC, but there's a place in my heart for global news, but it doesn't really resonate outside of Canada, so I just kind of edit that part out to make things simpler. Global always had a name bigger than an aspiration bigger than its presence when I was there. It was more like regional, but it was a good place to start a career. I love being a journalist. I mean, I was very lucky. I decided, I think, about the age of 13 or 14 that I wanted to be a reporter, and I never lost sight of it. I thought I wanted to be in print and just kind of stumbled into TV. The truth is that I'd been traveling after... Oh, I have to confess, I'm not a Western alumnus. I'm actually a Queens man, so... Thank you. We could do an oil thigh up here, except I don't remember the rest of the words. I stumbled into Global because a friend of mine said, they're always firing people here, you should apply. And if we have time later, I can tell you sort of how I landed that job on the spot when I showed up. But I had this, I think on the bucket list of a career, I'm one of the lucky ones because I actually ticked all of the boxes and many more that I could never have imagined. I don't think being a war correspondent was on the bucket list for me. It just kind of happens when you're a network correspondent at a senior level and a war happens and they call on the senior team and say, we need you to go to Baghdad or Pakistan, etc. And it kind of tests your mettle as a journalist. Do you really believe in what you say you stand for? And so you just go. And it is incredibly hard. The stress, the uncertainty, the danger, the horror. There's a lot of that. A lot of death and maiming, and a lot of deprivation and sadness. There's also, curiously, a lot of insight into. War is not really the way it's depicted, in the sense that what we show on TV is real and what they show in the movies is real, but actually most of war is just normalcy. And then there are these moments of a bomb going off or guns firing, and suddenly things are harrowing and unpredictable and have horrible outcomes. And then there's a calm, and people try to deal with that, and then gradually normalcy returns, and it just kind of goes through this erratic pattern. I went from CBC to CBS in New York, as Jeremy said, and then to ABC. I think I've reported from more than 40 countries. That's a picture of me on the beach in Patagonia with a penguin researcher in Argentina. I mean, to get paid to go to Patagonia to hang out with penguins is about as good as a job gets. They smell, by the way. That's the one thing that you don't get in the pictures. They stink. But they're so ridiculously fun to watch. And this woman was she was a researcher from Washington State University, putting homing devices on their backs, gluing them on so she could see how far they went out to get fish. And she'd done this for many years so she could see how much further they were having to go to fill their bellies with fish to come back and feed their young. That is a thrill. That's me in I think it's an F-16. I was smiling because that's before we landed. I threw up twice in the air. They forgot to tell me when there are all sorts of things you do to avoid that, and the pilot forgot to tell me. But it was an interesting experience once. I don't need to do it again. And that's me outside of Muammar Gaddafi's hometown in Libya in 2011, while they were still hunting for him during the Arab Spring. So what I want to talk about today, well, before I do that, actually, let me just tell you, I left that 5 years ago exactly to build an AI startup for transcription. Those of you who are in journalism, media, understand the pain of transcription. And I was foolish enough to ask some software developers I met just by chance, why do I have to transcribe my interviews in 2014 it was, the way they did in the 1970s, when automated speech to text is so my phone is ringing on my darn watch. There. And it, of course, because it's an Apple Watch, it's out of date, and it's. There we go. Now Siri's going to talk to me in a second. I'll just turn it off. There we go. Anyway, it led to a discussion, why couldn't we leverage artificial intelligence and natural language processing to do this? And then the question was, well, what would it have to do? And it turned out that I actually had a pretty good understanding of what it had to do, and I didn't know it. And that's how I left ABC News to become an inventor, an entrepreneur, and CEO 5 years ago. Raised a little bit of money to start it. There were 3 developers and me. I just yesterday hired employee 55. We have 44 people in our headquarters in London, England, and 11 in Toronto, where we have our North American HQ for sales and customer support, and we continue to hire. We have about 10,000 users per month. I think we hit user 300,000 a couple of months ago. So it turns out that we actually, that aching desire I had not to have to transcribe every interview, speech, news conference, things like this, to write my stories was actually one shared very broadly, not just in journalism, but in academic research, marketing research, all sorts of areas. So I suddenly find myself, no business degree, no understanding of a spreadsheet, had never really thought about what a KPI was. The first time I was asked what a KPI was, I had to turn my computer and go, oh, key performing indicator? And I what's that? So I suffer constantly from the imposter syndrome, but miraculously, the company is thriving and the product is working, and it's really, really exciting to watch it to really transform not just newsrooms, but a lot of other workflows in our everyday lives. So I want to talk to you about 5 lessons that I learned as a war correspondent that unwittingly and unexpectedly actually made me a better inventor, entrepreneur, boss, CEO. And I think that what we don't really appreciate as journalists is that any good journalist is, by definition, an entrepreneur. I spent most of my career hustling stories, trying to persuade my bosses to listen to my ideas for stories rather than do their stupid ideas. And my best defense against doing stupid stories was to come up with good stories that they liked. And I got pretty good at it because I managed to persuade them for 10 years to spend a lot of money letting me travel through Latin America in between breaking news stories, and visited every country in Latin America but 4 small ones, and got to know a lot of those countries very well, and told some stories that I think really mattered. Some were fun, some were serious, some were transformative. But I want to take you on 5 journeys that really, I think, help tell the story of how one career unexpectedly helped shape another. You know, I call myself, quite honestly, the accidental entrepreneur. So I'm going to take you first of all to Haiti. In 2004, there was a coup d'etat. It's an asterisk to the history of that country, which is full of hardship and horror and corruption and kleptomania in ways that are really hard to fathom. I think in many ways, of all the many countries I've been to, it's the saddest place on earth. And it probably caused me more nightmares than war zones. The abject poverty is just beyond comprehension. So in 2004, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a priest turned president who had come in to save the country from all of its centuries of corruption, was going to be a man of the people, had become, what a surprise, another democratic despot, abusing his power, stealing, and really betraying every promise he ran on. And so there was a revolution. And guerrillas, meaning just an insurgent group with guns, these are not highly organized groups, started to assemble in the north of Haiti and move towards Port-au-Prince, the capital. I went in to cover this, and it was really difficult. I talked to you about poverty. This is one of the images that really haunts me. This boy is standing before river mud that they sold to feed to hungry children, and they'd put a little bit of oil or butter on it. It had no nutritional value, but it filled their hungry bellies. And it's just one of those images that, for me, it just shakes you to the core. And these women are selling charcoal. The country is famously deforested because people have cut down trees, and these women are hoping to make the equivalent of about 5 cents to get something for their families. So I'm with my crew, and it gets very, very violent. And there are machetes flying at people, and it's very bloody, and it is not an easy assignment. And there are fires in the streets. You've seen images like this. I land an interview with President Aristide, which took a lot of negotiation, and it was a big deal because he hadn't talked to many journalists during all of this, and he was resolute that he would not actually leave. What happens is they asked me to go back and set up an interview for George Stephanopoulos, who hosts the ABC News Sunday morning show. So this is the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince, one of the most beautiful buildings there. And we set up the interview for Sunday morning. We go down at sunrise to the presidential palace, and I note, and the streets of Port-au-Prince, which never sleep, are surprisingly empty, and there's just this strange sense that something's wrong. We go to the palace, and the main gate that we'd gone in a few days before when I did that interview is padlocked, and the guards are very jittery when we get out and say to me in French, "Get out of here." I said, no, you don't understand. We have an interview with the president. Like, open the door. And they said, no. And so we go to the back gate, the service entrance, and this time they put guns in our faces and they say, "You're not going in, get out of here." At that point, the presidential palace is surrounded by those kind of concrete barriers that are used to stop people from ramming trucks through fences. And there's a chicane. There's only one entrance into the palace, and you have to sort of do this chicane so that the guerrillas can't start ramming the fences of the you can see the fence at the bottom of this photograph. What it doesn't show is the barricades, but they wanted to make sure that they couldn't take vehicles and ram. So, okay, my slides are advancing. What happens at that point catches us by surprise. We're leaving. We realize something's very wrong. What we don't know at the time is that Aristide has been kidnapped by the opposition and spirited out of, in his pajamas, out of Port-au-Prince to Suriname in a private plane during the night. And that's why they didn't want to let us in. So I called New York and I said, "There's something very wrong. We're not getting in, and we think and it's not clear what's happened to Aristide." At that point, suddenly there's this burst of gunfire coming from the direction we're trying to drive. And it was the only way out. It wasn't aimed at us, but it was in our direction. I don't think it was aimed at us. It wasn't hitting us. And I panicked. I mean, the truth is, it's quite humbling, but I said, oh my God, we got to get out of here. And I think I said other things too that probably were slightly less polite. And what was really interesting, we travel when we're in war zones with private security. Usually, ABC News uses a company called Pilgrim, which hires ex-Special Forces soldiers from the British and New Zealand Army. I don't know why, but that's what they do. And these guys, some of them are paramedics, because in places like this, where there's no medical care, you need to make sure that if one of us is hurt, that there's somebody who can do that triage that's needed to at least hope to get you somewhere safely. So I panicked, and the security guy turns around and he says, shut the fuck up, you're not helping. And it was a really humbling moment, because he was right. And I realized that in a position of responsibility, I could never let that happen again. And the reason is that when you are a journalist fronting a team, or you're a CEO running a company and you have 54 employees, or you're the dean of a media school, people are looking to you for cues. And I realized instantly that I had acted that I had acted badly, and that I had actually clouded my own judgment, distracted those who needed to make decisions from making what were incredibly important decisions to find us a safe way out, and undermined my own credibility as a leader. And so, fast forward to running a company where things go wrong all the time. Thankfully, they're only metaphorical landmines, but you have to deal almost on a daily basis when you're building a fast-growing startup with crises, problems, threats of all sizes. And what happens when you're in my job is that they're looking to you for cues. And so, I remember there was a time I was at a conference in Amsterdam, and I get this call saying, the system's crashed, we are completely down. And that is just catastrophic for a company trying to build credibility. And my reaction, which came very much from Haiti, was, okay, let's first of all get a notice up on the website saying that we have some technical problems, bear with us, we're sorry. And then let's wake up the team, and let's make sure that we get them working through the night to fix it. And keep me posted, and let's just keep talking. We use Slack, so we started this conversation. And that kind of, there's just nothing is gained by yelling at people. We all know that. And when you see people yelling during crisis, you realize that it distracts them. So it was an incredibly valuable lesson that I carry with me. I would say there's a terribly sad epilogue. The 2010 earthquake destroyed that palace and most of Haiti. It's heartbreaking to see this, but believe me, there were many homes destroyed in the process too. Haiti did not recover from that earthquake and lives in abject poverty and abject despair still. So, when the shit hits the fan, you need to stay calm. Lesson number 1. Lesson number 2. It's always perilous to assume people know what you're thinking. Let's go to Libya and the Arab Spring. So, 2011, the Arab Spring starts in Tunisia next door in February 2011. Very unexpectedly, the longtime dictator is overthrown, and nobody really cares because it's Tunisia, which isn't geopolitically that important. But a few weeks later, Libya, which has actually got only 6 million people, Tunisia's 10 million, but has oil, also has an uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. And everybody knows who Muammar Gaddafi is because he's been in power for 42 years. And it is a very rich oil state that also supplies, through pipelines, about a third of the natural gas that fuels Europe. And so strategically, Libya really matters. The moment it happens in Libya, I'm on a plane to Tripoli. This is Green Square in Tripoli. And that's Gaddafi, known as the brother leader, and this is the obscenely opulent, gilded Rixos Hotel, which was his official guest house, which is where the American media and the major global media were put, where they could keep an eye on us, and I'm sure listen to everything we said and watch us through hidden cameras. We were followed by minders. one of the most unpleasant job descriptions in the world. These are people who, particularly when you're an American television correspondent, the moment you try to leave the hotel compound, they follow you, and you can see there is literally our minder telling our cameraman where he can point his camera and where he can't. And what we used to call the little green men, green was the color of Gaddafi's national flag, would suddenly appear before our cameras to profess their love for Gaddafi. But as I said, war has its moments of just sheer normalcy, and so these men are on the Mediterranean coast fishing for sardines during a revolution. So I end up in Tunis. This is my 5th trip to Libya. The revolution starts in February, and it just stalls. And it's a deadlock. NATO gets involved to protect the people because Gaddafi says he's going to slaughter them. But even then, it just deadlocks. And I end up in there just as coming back, just as Gaddafi is clearly going to start falling. We drive from Tunis to Tripoli because the airports are closed, obviously, and the coastal road, so we have to go through the desert. It's a grueling 3-day drive. It's also Ramadan, so people and it's 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, so people are not drinking water or eating anything from sunrise to sunset. So it's a very kind of surreal experience just trying to get in. Here we are crossing the border, and we're in 2 vehicles. We always travel for safety in 2 vehicles. We didn't have our security. New York, ABC News in New York decided it would be better if we had Arabic-speaking security, which in theory was a good idea, except that they ended up bringing in 2 men from Libya, from Beirut, who were clearly not qualified to do what we'd asked of them, and they missed their flights. We ended up going on our own, and my producer and I were with the crew, and we had one driver, we hired a second, and we made it across, and it was Ramadan, so they were breaking fast, and when you're on deadline and people say, no, you must come and break bread with us, it's very hard to say no, and it's like, okay, I'm hungry, but really, we have to get somewhere where we can file our story. So it's a very lovely, sweet experience to be asked to a family's celebrations. And so we quickly eat and we move on. We get in our 2 vehicles and we head to the next town. I think it was Nalut. And we have radios between us. And I say, hey, Bruno, to my producer on the radio. And the driver says, Bruno's not here. He's with you. And I go, no, he's not. And we've left the town half an hour ago. I'm thinking he's in one car, and they're thinking he's in another. And we realize that we've left him with the family eating their Ramadan meal. So we go back, and there's Bruno enjoying watermelon. He's going, I thought I might see you again. We just kind of didn't really connect. All of that was kind of comical, but it actually became quite serious as we approached Tripoli. That's me on an army base transcribing manually my interviews, and that's us picking up gas to go through the desert. These are war graves of 20-year-old Libyan rebels who were trying to overthrow Gaddafi that we passed. We made it into Tripoli just as Gaddafi's compound was being overthrown, and you can see the city was burning. It was an incredibly powerful and emotional and chaotic experience. And we asked we said, okay, we will put, I said to the drivers, Bruno and I, at this point, the Beirut security guys had caught up with us, but it was very clear they weren't really qualified to do what they'd been hired to do, and they were kind of 2 clowns in our minds, and we didn't really trust them. But we were focused on getting our story. We said, okay, we took the two drivers, one in a pickup truck, one in an SUV, said, okay, you wait away from the compound in this rubble-strewn lot. We're going to go get the story. Don't move. We'll be back. So we go in, and this kind of chaos is happening. My new best friends, these rebel dudes. This is a forbidden city that people would have been shot at if they'd tried to enter until this day for 42 years. suddenly things, after getting our story and getting this extraordinarily rich material, we're leaving and there's sniper fire. And it is aimed at all of us on the street there. One of the things about sniper fire is that these were tracer bullets, by the way, which are very dramatic to see because you can actually see the red streaks as they're going through the sky. There were some Gaddafi holdouts in an apartment building over here, and they, over here? Over there. They were just randomly firing into the crowd to say, we're not dead yet, we're not gone, we still support the brother leader. These people are running away from the bullets right into them, and Bruno had the presence to say, no, hug the wall over here so that the bullets are going over our heads. We didn't see anybody get hurt at this point, but it was incredibly dangerous. We made it out, and we get back to the lot where we'd left the vehicles. And we have the biggest story in the world, probably for 2011, which is that Muammar Gaddafi has been overthrown after this very long revolution. We are going to lead the newscast. This is one of the biggest stories in a 30-year career that I have ever covered. And we get there, and the vehicles are gone. And we go, where did they go? And we knew one of the drivers, but the other we didn't. And we had $100,000, $200,000 worth of equipment in the vehicles. What are we going to do? So I say to the security guard, can you call the drivers? And he says, I didn't have time to get their phone numbers. We spent hours in the desert driving. And really, a small part of me died because we had no way to find them. It was complete chaos on the streets. And there were you could hear bullets, you could see mortar fire landing within reach of us, and there we were standing in basically a rubble-strewn parking lot with the clothes on our backs and our camera, and it was really terrifying, both physically because we were in danger, but also, frankly, I saw my entire career flash before me. Because when you're a network correspondent on the biggest story in the world, you cannot call New York and say, by the way, we lost our equipment, so we can't file tonight. That just doesn't wash. It doesn't matter if it's not your fault. Your job is to deliver the story, and excuses have absolutely just hold nothing. So what had happened was actually, because of all the mortar fire and the tracer bullets, the drivers had very wisely moved their vehicles into a narrow laneway to protect them and the equipment. And what seemed probably like a very long time, but was probably only 20 minutes or half an hour passed. We contemplated at one point getting in a vehicle and going to the BBC, where the BBC was, because we knew, because at that point ABC worked with the BBC, and we thought, well, we can beg our way and do it on camera or something and borrow their satellite or their uplinks. And thankfully, one of the drivers shows up, and he said, here we are. And we actually managed to go and get our story, working through the night. I didn't sleep for a couple of days, but we made it on air. That's actually a shot I took on my camera of a mortar. You could see it landing as we were driving in that direction. It was really, really harrowing that whole evening. But the lesson for me was you just can't assume people know what you're thinking. It gets you into real danger. And so it's all about over-communicating. And I think any role in leadership, any role in management is about over-communicating, making clear. It's not doing people's job, it's just making sure that we understand what the job is and what needs to be done. And for me, that clarity is brought, I face it every day running a fast-growing startup, because I can no longer, when we were 6 or 10 people, we could sit around one table and everybody knew what everybody was doing. I'm here, they're in London, England, and in Toronto making decisions. I have to assume that we are all on the same page. And so over-communicating, making sure that we know what the deliverables are, what the expectations are, who's responsible for what. And most importantly, I say to people, my job is to enable you to do yours. My job is to move blockers if there are things in the way. you need to let me know. And if you need to wake me up at 3 in the morning because the system crashes or you can't find someone and there's an emergency, just do it. So, over-communication for me was lesson 2. This one's a bit gruesome, just to give you a heads up. One of the things that you do when you're a war correspondent is if you work for a big network, is you go to war correspondent training camp, which is actually a very serious exercise, and I did it 3 times. I did it twice in the US, I think, and once in England, where you go away for a week, and there are 15 or 20 journalists from ABC and from other networks and news organizations who are going to be covering war zone. And they teach you survival training, instinct, sort of war zone behavior, first aid, and kidnap training. And what they do is they hire 6 or 10 actors to play villagers in this kind of fictitious cross between Bosnia, Libya, and somewhere in Latin America. And what they say to you is, listen, this is serious learning. No wisecracks, and nobody cracks jokes. I mean, it's really interesting. You're given assignments, things happen that surprise you, and it's all about applying what you learn in the classroom under pressure. One of the things that they teach you is you're not doctors, and we take advanced first aid, but you must understand that this is only for you and your colleagues, and that if people ask you for medical help, you are not qualified and you will get yourself in trouble. And at some point in the next day or two, when we were in Red Hill, south of London, on this exercise, we were sent to go from one village to another. And as we're going along, the fictitious villagers wave us down, and one of them is holding what looks like a baby, which is a plastic doll wrapped in a blanket. And they say, help, help, our baby is sick, please, please help. And instead of saying, we're going to go to the next village and send help, one of the women on our team from CNN said, oh, show me your baby, and completely ignoring what we'd just been taught. And on the baby was taped, this baby is dead. And of course, what happens at that point is that the villagers turn on her and say, you've murdered our baby. Instead of helping, you have murdered our baby. And it becomes very chaotic. And of course, this is all role play and fictitious, but believe me, you feel it. And you understand that you can get yourself into situations that you may not get yourself out of. So, fast forward to Libya 2011 again. Actually, this is the day after what I just showed you. So we go back to Gaddafi's compound. That was Tuesday. This is Wednesday. And Gaddafi has fallen in Tripoli. And we're broadcast. This is Green Square now, called Revolution Square. This is the banned imperial flag, which has come back. Those, by the way, those 2 things are what are called BGANs. They are how we broadcast there, kind of the current one of the new technologies used to replace the massive satellites that when I began my career, we used to take 16, 20 suitcases that would build a satellite. It cost thousands to ship it. You needed a satellite engineer. It was incredibly cumbersome. Now you can just take the equivalent of a laptop. So we go back to Gaddafi's compound, and we see, as we go in, we see that all of the celebration from yesterday is not universally felt, and that the area has not been pacified, and we hear bullets and we're told don't go any further, at which point this truck comes up, and in the back is a man who has been severely injured. He actually had a catastrophic wound to his neck. A bullet had pierced his artery. Now, my first aid training, which is fairly advanced, all you do when someone has a catastrophic wound is take anything. It can be a dirty, oil-soaked rag. You've got to stop the bleeding because they will lose their blood and die. You can get rid of infections, but you can't put blood back into a body. And they didn't do that. Candidly, there was no hospital open, so even if they had, he probably would have died. But it is horrifying to be standing there watching someone die, knowing that even basic efforts to save him, which I knew how to do, they didn't do. The reality is that there were 20 teenagers standing around saying Allah Akbar, hoping that God would save their friend, and God didn't, and he died. And we sort of stood back uncomfortably watching this unfold. Here's the story.
Tonight of chaos and violence. The rebels who seized Muammar Gaddafi's compound are doing everything they can to hunt him down, believing earlier today that he was cornered near Tripoli's airport. But tonight, Gaddafi is still on the run, and ABC's Jeffrey Kofman is in Tripoli, reporting between bursts of gunfire.
This is not what victory is meant to look like. Just a day after Gaddafi's compound fell, no celebration, no throngs of curious gawkers. Instead, snipers. Who's on top of that building? Rebel soldier Mohammed bin Tan was telling us why we should go no further. We were not about to test his words.
This road is not safe.
Yeah, it's an institute. But you want, you see? You see?
All right, yeah.
We're at as far as we can go inside the Gaddafi compound. Let's go this way, please.
Those snipers hit this rebel in the neck. He died before our eyes. He lived to taste just one day of free liberty. There was real concern for the safety of 35 journalists and others being held by Gaddafi's loyalists at Tripoli.
You never forget when you see moments like that happen. It goes without saying that when you see people die in front of you, particularly in gruesome circumstances, it sticks with you. I still hear the crack of those guns. When I hear fireworks, I don't carry those images with me, but when I hear certain sounds, those things come back. But what really I think that demonstrated was just in the rawest of forms is that you need to know your limits in life and when you're in any situation, but certainly in a much more elemental, much more protected, cocooned way. When you're doing what I do as an entrepreneur and CEO, there are a million things I don't know. I have no, as I said to you, no business training. I have no marketing training. I have no technical training. I just had a pretty good idea, and beyond that, I rely on others. So it's, I think, one of the essential things for survival is admitting what you can't do. And candidly, I don't think you can be a good journalist if you're embarrassed about asking stupid questions, and there is nothing more fatal for a journalist in his or her career than pretending you know something you don't, because you will get caught, because the public will find you, and they will they will ridicule you, they will abuse you, and they will humble you, and if you ever do it once, you'll never do it again. Lesson 4. So in Iraq, 2003. When Saddam was falling, we would drive in from Amman. It's a miserable 12-hour drive through the desert from Amman, and you get caught in sandstorms. And we went in large convoys twice a week. They would leave from Amman just for safety, because we would go with all the different global news organizations, and the idea being that there'd be strength in numbers if something went wrong. This is just after Saddam Hussein fell in, I guess it was May, June of 2003, when there was sort of attempts at bringing some normalcy back to life on the streets of Baghdad and around, these sort of very exotic images of Baghdad coming back to life with the dictator now on the run. I was broadcasting, that's broadcasting live into Good Morning America. You work around the clock because the time zones kill you. And at this point, the Americans were loved because the Americans had vanquished Saddam Hussein, a very violent, evil, cruel dictator who had abused, tortured, raped, and done horrible things against his people. Then in June of 2003, there was this kind of change suddenly. Instead of being loved, the Americans started being attacked. And it was very hard to understand at the moment what was happening, but it was what they called an IED, an improvised explosive device, which was in a dog carcass or some debris on the roadside, would be tripped as a vehicle like that. A Humvee drove by, and a couple of American soldiers would be killed. And initially it seemed like an isolated incident, and then after about a week or two of this, we thought, this is really, there's a pattern building here, and something bad is happening. This sense of joy and euphoria is now turning into a sense of siege. And then the power lines got blown up. And what happened was, obviously, that the insurgents started to gather, and the Americans under George Bush made some catastrophically bad decisions, which came back to haunt them by taking anybody who'd been in Saddam's government and throwing them and making them powerless. And the problem was these were powerful people made powerless, and they had guns and they had connections, and so they were able to regroup as insurgents quite effectively and undermine the American efforts to sow the seeds of democracy. And what happened was soldiers who were told, you get us to Baghdad, get Saddam out of here, you can go back home to the US, suddenly were being told, no, you have to stay. And this is now June, July, and I exaggerate not, it was in Fahrenheit 140 degrees in Baghdad, which would be about, gosh, I'm not sure, that must be close to 50 degrees Celsius. It was witheringly hot and uncomfortable, and air conditioning is pretty absent in a war zone. So it was really difficult, and for the soldiers, it was even more difficult than it was for us. So we get word that one division of soldiers of the army that had been sitting in Kuwait for a year waiting for this, and who had their stay extended, had 3 times, were packing up, and this day in July had been told, guess what, guys, unpack, you're staying another 6 months. And you can only imagine how utterly dispiriting that is, thinking, finally, they're going to let us go home, we're out of this place. So there were no phone systems at that point. This is in Fallujah, outside of Baghdad. There was no way to communicate. The infrastructure had been destroyed. So we decided we would take our vehicles and drive to this army base. The Americans had occupied an abandoned Iraqi army base. And we drive up to you can see these guys in the bottom corner are guarding the base, and they sort of train their guns on us, and we're thinking, what do we say? And we yell, "Good morning, America!" And they went, "Come on in." And it was the easiest brand. It was easier to say "Good morning, America" than it was to say ABC News. And what we encountered was this incredible sense of anger at George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who were the 3 architects of the Iraq invasion. That was really extraordinary. I'd never seen it in a war situation or in a military situation where there was such open contempt. And I said to the base commander, "Can we just talk to some of your soldiers?" And he said, "Anyone you want." So we did, and I assembled 8 of them around a table, and we put the camera, and I said, asked them some questions, and there were some kind of fairly bland answers about it's hot here and it's uncomfortable. And then I said, if Donald Rumsfeld, the U.S. Secretary of Defense at the time, were sitting with us here now, what would you say to him? Which is, by the way, for those of you who've studied journalism, a kind of classic, open-ended, unbiased question, because it doesn't say you should say good things or bad things, it just provokes them to think. And there's some nervous giggles, and one young soldier, enlisted man, said, "I would say, sir, you should resign." And this unleashed this torrent of anger towards Rumsfeld and President Bush and others. And it on camera, and we had permission, and I thought, this is really odd. And I finished it, I called New York on my satellite phone, and I said, I just got some really extraordinary anger from soldiers that is just completely uncharacteristic of the way military should work. So we put it on, and it went on World News that night and Good Morning America the next day. And the next morning, the Drudge Report, which was the conservative website at the time in 2003, the most influential. It's not now. Kind of a mixture of Breitbart and Fox News. It was the go-to for conservative Republicans. Published an article saying that the journalist, the reporter, the ABC News reporter who reported this story from Iraq on troop disenchantment was both Canadian and gay. And I had actually done a profile in The Advocate, the major gay magazine in the U.S., about being an openly gay war correspondent. And we've done that strategically because I felt it was very important to own my story and not be, and so that was not a big deal. ABC, had negotiated that with The Advocate a year or two earlier, and it seemed like a prudent thing to do, which it was, because it was, so what? But the odd thing was that they said I was Canadian and gay. And so that led to, this is Maureen Dowd, who still writes for the New York Times, doing a piece. What happened was the Drudge reported this, and then the next day, the Washington Post reported that Drudge actually hadn't seen the story, that it was the Bush White House that planted this. And so it was a disinformation campaign that the Bush White House was actually trying to discredit the story and discredit me. And so it became actually, in its own small way, a big international story, because it was evidence that they were losing control of the narrative and they were blaming the messenger. And so one of the interesting things that happened was I was sitting in Baghdad, and ABC was being deluged with requests for interviews. And we sort of talked strategically about how to handle this, and agreed that, those reporters, they always want you to say bad things. And that I wasn't going to be drawn into criticizing the White House. And so I just, it's interesting when you're the one being questioned, because you need we're so critical of message tracks in the Canadian election campaign, you heard it in the debate, but you do need to think about how you want your message to be presented. And what I wanted to say was, listen, I'm sitting here in Baghdad, Iraqis, American troops, other troops are being killed and injured every day. My focus is on bringing that story to our viewers. I'm not interested in getting into a mudslinging match with the White House. That's my job. And then they persisted. And the attacks became more vicious from the White House. And and there was a lot of interest in the fact that they pointed out that I was both Canadian and gay. And I said, well, the line just kind of came to me. I said, this is really, really difficult for me, because I've never told my parents that I'm Canadian. And what it led to was this really great spin that came back and just threw mud back at the White House. Even Fox News came to my defense and said the guy was just doing his job, buzz off. And so it ended up actually really discrediting the White House. But it was very much really about taking control of the narrative of your own story. And, whether by neglect or by ignorance, it's very easy for stories, for your own narrative, to spin out of control or be told by others in ways that you don't want. And so it's very important in any position, and certainly in the one I'm in now, to understand how you want to be seen. And it's not about lying, it's not about obfuscating, but it's about understanding what's the message that I want people to get. And the message I wanted was to say, big deal. Doesn't throw me off my game. And it worked. It worked incredibly effectively. And so it gave me this understanding of really knowing what you want people to take away from your story, and how you want your company, your team to be communicated. Finally, in 2009 there was a coup d'etat in Honduras, which is really, again, you talk about sort of minor players in the global stage, and I didn't really understand why they wanted me to go, because I just thought American network news does not care about a place like Honduras having a coup d'etat. And I thought, we're spending a lot of money to get here. There is no way the story is going to get on air, and then they're going to complain that we spent money that we didn't need to. And this is the kind of impossible narrative that you get into with the bosses in New York, and kind of going, you don't want to say no, but your hunch is this isn't going to happen. So we arrive, and the Honduran army has surrounded the presidential palace and the whole Tegucigalpa, which is, by the way, the capital of Honduras, is militarized by the new president, Roberto Micheletti, who's taken over in this coup. And here we are in front of the presidential palace with my cameraman and my producer. And we had, in all these places, journalists have what they call fixers. And fixers are men and women who are local, who speak the language, but more importantly, know sort of who to call. And Honduras the fixer in Honduras had actually not been called for 10 years because there had been no story in Honduras. And she showed up in the airport in the middle of this coup in a long sort of Chanel-like dress and black stilettos. And this incredibly elegant upper-class woman in this desperately poor country. And it was this kind of odd juxtaposition of real affluence amidst this kind of uncertainty of a coup. But she was an incredibly smart, resourceful woman. And I said to Yulia, listen, we're here. It's not clear what the story is for Americans, but the only way this is going to get on air is if we meet the new president. And so she said, well, I know somebody in his team. Let me see if I can call him on his cell phone. So she calls, and somebody else answers, and she leaves a message. So we go to the presidential palace, and these rings of guards are there. And I speak Spanish, and I said, at that point, I think we may have talked to somebody who said, well, if I can get to the president, I'll try to help you, but no promises. That was enough of a kind of thread of truth that I could say to these guys, we're waiting for our meeting with the president. And they said, well, we can't let you through. And it was this kind of battle of wills. And I said, you do not want to say to your new president that he didn't get an interview with American television because you wouldn't let us in, do you? And they let us through. And we gradually got closer and closer. And we get to the gates of the presidential palace. And we get in. And I see Roberto Micheletti walking. And I say, Signor Presidente, dame un minuto, por favor. I have an interview. And he says, come back and wait for me. I'll be back. I said, I'm with ABC News. He said, wait for me. I'll be back in 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, I'm called in. I sit down. And just as we're setting up our gear, and just as I'm ready, we're getting ready to roll, I get on my BlackBerry, because this is 2009, before iPhones took over. I get this text from this message from the foreign editor at ABC News in New York saying, is there a story here? And I said, well, I'm just about to interview the president. I'm sitting in his office. And he said, ha ha, nice try. And I said, actually, I'm not joking. He said, how did you do that? You just landed less than an hour ago. And so Micheletti comes in, and I said, and I begin. He speaks English, and I said, so what do I call you? Are you Mr. President? And he said, yeah, you can call me that, but you, Jeffrey, you can call me Roberto. And it was just the oddest experience to be in this sort of banana republic with this guy who had seized power. He lasted a couple of weeks in power, but in the end, I got the story on air, and they loved it because it was just this odd story about what happens when you're sent to cover. How do you cover I did it kind of as a reporter's diary. But they loved it because I got in and I actually got this guy, and he, in this slightly comical way, casually said, yeah, you don't need to call me Mr. President. And so what I was able to do was, through sheer tenacity, pull the rabbit out of the hat and I actually delivered this story. There I am with Micheletti. And I didn't bring a blazer with me. I didn't actually think to dress formally for a coup d'etat, but they're very, the upper classes of Central America and Latin America, they're very formal. So I asked his press secretary if I could borrow his blazer. So that's actually not my blazer in the you can see I've got sort of multi-pocketed camos on because you just need places to put all your stuff. And so I'm actually wearing the press secretary's oversized blazer for this so that I didn't appear too disrespectful to President Micheletti. So the lesson number 5, when you're told you can't, you just keep going. And boy, if there's a single lesson in 5 years of building a startup against all odds, it is that. So with that, thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes? There are no silly questions, remember that.
Films like Salvador and Welcome to Sarajevo, do they get more corresponding right? And my serious question is, what's the effect of outrage culture and Twitter mobs on the ability for you guys to report fact-based stories fairly?
Gosh. So I don't think I've seen either of those, but I think... Yeah, in general, it's hard for me. I couldn't watch the newsroom. I mean, I love Aaron Sorkin. I watched West Wing, but it was filled with just fundamental errors. Whoever was advising them on the kind of the reality of workflow, I get the drama, storytelling part, condensing moments, all of that, but it's really hard to actually capture the reality of what it's like. I think probably today we're better at it. I think the Marie Colvin film. Marie Colvin was the American woman who was a war correspondent for the Sunday Times in London, who was killed in Syria a couple of years ago. I don't have very many heroes. Marie Colvin would definitely be one of my heroes. And if you haven't seen the documentary on her or the film on her, I highly recommend them both. I actually think the documentary is better, and it is utterly harrowing. And I am nothing as a war correspondent compared to what she accomplished and her values. And her fearlessness in telling the story. Listen, Twitter. I think Twitter and Facebook have completely upended democracy. The architects of democracy did not anticipate social media and savants like Mark Zuckerberg who just don't get the consequences of what they've done. I think that we are in a true test of the future of liberal democracy and freedoms right now. And, I have to be an optimist, but, when we see what's happening in the UK with Brexit, in the US with Trump, and in Hungary and in Poland, and I think the disinformation that's coming out of Russia, I think that Twitter and Facebook really have undermined far from making democracy more transparent, have really made it more open to manipulation, and it scares the hell out of me. And frankly, part of me is really happy not to be in Washington reporting on Trump. I would find it extremely difficult. I understand what integrity and fairness is, but it is just such the relentless lies. And the question about truth, we are in a post-truth era. I mean, who knew that George Orwell in 1984 would capture that he was actually writing what we thought at the time was fiction was in fact heavily nuanced fact, and he was so prescient in understanding how language can be turned on its head and people will accept it. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
When you were in Iraq, did you come across the Guardian reporter Kate Abdullah?
No. I knew a bunch of Guardian reporters, but not that one. Yes? So when September 11th happened, I was in Miami. I remember, we all probably, anybody who's old enough would remember where we were when we heard about the World Trade Center. And a bunch of people were sent to Afghanistan and elsewhere. And they had to keep, they don't send everybody overseas at the same time. And about 6 weeks later, and I thought, well, okay, the story happens, it will unfold, and at some point maybe I'll get involved. six or so weeks later, I don't remember the timing. I think it was in the fall, or maybe it was actually early September, early in December in 2002. Daniel Pearl, the brilliant India-Pakistan reporter for the Wall Street Journal, was kidnapped while trying to trace some of the source of bin Laden's support. And it was announced that he was kidnapped, and I get a call from New York saying, we need you to go to Islamabad tonight. And literally I drove home, got my passport, and packed. And I turned on, I think my flight, I was going through London, picking up one of our producers in London and flying on Pakistan International Airways to Islamabad. And I'm literally packing my stuff, watching Peter Jennings, who, for those of you old enough would know, the Canadian who anchored ABC News for 20 or so years. I'm in my bedroom in Miami Beach, getting my stuff ready for a trip to a place I've never been. And the lead story is that Daniel Pearl has been kidnapped. And Martha Raddatz, the State Department correspondent, comes on with her story and says, and they have declared a jihad on any American journalist in Pakistan. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's me. And I'm thinking, I mean, I don't know if I actually did it, but I think I had some shirts in my hand and I dropped them. I'm not sure, but I feel like I did if I didn't. And I thought, wow, I'm really getting myself into something difficult and dangerous here. But, again, what do you do? Call up and say, I don't really want to go. And so I got on the flight, and actually, there's a funny story about that. They managed to get to me, I think it was $20,000 US in cash, because in Pakistan at that point, and probably today, you can't pay bills. You couldn't pay bills with credit card. So I had a fanny pack with $20,000 in cash, and I have to sign for it. And you can't really tell your bosses you've lost $20,000 US dollars in cash. And so nobody knows that that's what's in your fanny pack. They just think you've got I don't know, some peanuts and stuff. So I go to London, and then I'm at Heathrow, transfer to another terminal. I meet Clark, my producer, and we have to, in the other terminal, go through X-ray again, put our hand luggage through X-ray, and it's a very long walk to the gate. And I get to the gate, and I'm boarding, and I go, and I realize that I had left the fanny pack on the X-ray belt with $20,000. And I went bolting through Heathrow, which is not a good thing to do after 9/11. And they're saying, Sarah, stop running. I said, please, I've left something in security. And I, panting, get back to security. And they said, we thought we might be seeing you again, sir. And I limp back on the plane, my heart racing, and land in Islamabad. And it was actually one of the most difficult places. The actual kidnapping happened in Karachi. Initially, ABC wouldn't let us go because it was so dangerous, and we got very frustrated and said, listen, we might as well be in London. Nothing's happening in Islamabad. We're just pretending we're in Pakistan. So we went to Karachi. We did some extraordinarily interesting and I think powerful storytelling, but it was so dangerous that we had to we did what we called guerrilla journalism, where we would only go to places for a couple of minutes so that we wouldn't be there long enough for people to do anything to us. And so we would go and we'd talk to people, we'd get some shots, we'd move on. And we were in a blackened Volkswagen minibus with sort of frills around the windows, the really kind of standard vehicle you've seen in Karachi for people to get around, with curtains, so we could do this. And when I was doing it on camera, I would make sure I had my lines right. I would have my wireless microphone on, as I do, and I would sort of get out, shoot it once, get back in, and we'd be gone before people knew what we could do, knew we were there. And that's how we operated for 5 or 6 weeks. We stayed in Karachi in the Marriott Hotel. 2 weeks after I left, that hotel was bombed, and I could see in the pictures my room, the windows were blown in. So, some of it's just good luck that you survive these things. But a lot of it's about instinct and sort of taking the best precautions you can. I know I've gone over, but any last questions? Yes?
Yeah, I guess coming off that, I just want to go back to that third story you were talking about.
Pardon?
I just want to go back to that third story you were talking about, where you watched that man die, and you had your first aid training.
Yeah.
Like, what was going through your head when that happened? Because, like, I can see, I feel that there was some kind of moral ethical implication to save a person, but as you said, that if that puts you at risk, and it puts.
I mean, I knew there were no hospitals. Tripoli, at the best of times, doesn't have much of a hospital for that kind of catastrophic wound. It's just, you have to think rationally. And, you have to look and say, there are a dozen or more young men screaming Allah Akbar, and, you just need to know that you... the executive producer of ABC News Nightline, which during its day, in its heyday was the best journalism on American television, said to me before I went to Haiti that time in 2004, he said, Haiti is the most volatile place I've ever covered. He said, things can go from good to bad, on a dime. My advice to you is no matter where you are, always have an exit strategy. And I could regale you with a couple of stories about that, but my stories, as you know, are not brief, and we'll be here till midnight if I keep telling you long stories. But you just need to know that you're not going to get yourself into, to the best of your ability, you're not going to get yourself into something you can't get yourself out of. And I think I wouldn't do anything differently today. I think we acted completely honorably. We stood back. We didn't sort of intrude. And, I'm not a doctor. I'm a reporter who knows first aid. It wouldn't have saved him. There was nowhere to take him. There was no hospital open. He was going to die. But had it been one of my colleagues, I would have at least tried. But that's the harsh reality. The world is not a clean, it's so easy for people, particularly with Twitter, to sort of sit in judgment of people and say they know better and that you've behaved wrong or whatever. It's just crap. I mean, I have no patience for these armchair critics who know better, and I think Twitter has unleashed these, just people who sit in judgment in their pajamas, at their laptops, and that's a polite way. There are other terms for them, but and you just, reality forces you to make difficult decisions. Any last questions? Okay, we go.
The hallway here, there's food and drink, so please, I hope everybody will join us. I'd like to say thank you for all of you for coming tonight very much and for joining us. And one more big thank you to Jeffrey, who will also be outside as well if you have any other questions.
Thank you.